All right. Hello and welcome to one and all. It is now time to continue the Theology and Peace Quarterly Speakers Series with a presentation from Ellen Corcella entitled The Power of Faith and Trauma-Informed Care to Move Rivalry to Relationship. Loving mimesis is a perennial topic in TMP gatherings as we work to clarify that mimesis does not have to be an over and against your neighbor sort of thing. And you can be swept along in mimetic currents and not be led to an enemy double whirlpool. At least, and I would say that this that we're after, at least some of us here at TMP are doggedly seeking to clarify in theory that is the very thing that trauma-informed care does in practice. What it does for patients in emergency medical contexts and for family members attending those patients. Ellen, with a second career as a chaplain in a trauma center in a major metropolitan hospital, regularly visited people who had been tossed into bereavement-induced paralysis. She has witnessed how people pass through that dreadful state, and she's researched how to nurture those who undergo this experience. And she's made her experiences and her research readily available in a brand new book that's just out. I'm going to throw some links here in the chat if anybody is interested. I comes highly recommended by me. I know there's other in the group here who have read it as well, and we're still eager to hear what Ellen has to say. So let's get to it. There will be a question and answer period at the conclusion of our time, and so please, as questions come to mind, go ahead and submit those. You can put those in the chat for everyone to see, or you can send them directly to January if you want, but I suggest putting them in the chat where everybody can see. And January is going to be taking in all the comments and do her best to sort them through into a coherent order to ask Ellen directly. So if you already have a few questions, or go ahead and put them in the chat for January to read. The sooner they end up in there, the more helpful it is for her. And as questions, maybe a question comes last minute, then type it in as quickly as you can. And yes, so with no further ado, Ellen, I will invite you to please begin.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you everyone for being here. And as you can see, my dog is here to hear the lecture as well. It's not a lecture. I'm hoping this is more of a conversation. I hope the title that was promoted and agreed on maybe a little while ago didn't oversell it. But the approach I decided to take was to sort of talk about how this book was laid out. And in the course of that, we will get to many of the concepts or practices that I've learned about and what I've learned myself. The book, well, I'll talk about it in a minute, but the book is both a spiritual memoir, so it's about my own spiritual life, my own experiences with trauma, but how they unfolded in real life and in learning or having to deal with highly traumatized people, learning that I had to deal with my own trauma. So it comes from a personal perspective. So anyway, if I'm not covering something that you do want to see, then you just let me know, and I will happily adjust my talk, because the book covers lots of subjects. I'm going to share a PowerPoint, mostly done to keep me on track than anything else. And can you all see that? Okay, good. All right, I'm going to take myself out of my view here for a minute. Okay, so I've changed it a little bit to the title of the book, A Journey Through the Landscape of Trauma, just to emphasize two things: that Trauma is always a journey. And trauma, there are various landscapes, both for how trauma is imposed or impacted or experienced, and how trauma changes, just like a landscape changes over time. Oops. Okay, so I'm just going to start with a very basic definition of trauma. What is trauma? Trauma is an event. People are out there talking about, oh, that's not trauma. Every bad event is trauma. No, trauma is an event that creates a sense that our life is at risk. It could be a psychological sense of risk. It could be a literal physical sense of risk, like I dealt with at the hospital. It can be a social construct, right? There's a lot of talk about communities that are traumatized. Often to create what we would call the traumatic effect, the person will rarely have an ability to control or escape the situation. So, for example, often I found in the hospital that people who had to be extracted from their motor vehicle, so they were in there maybe an hour or two just waiting for someone to get them out, they were more likely to feel traumatized than someone who may have facilitated their own escape from the vehicle. But Peter Levine talks a lot about that notion of escape. What trauma does, an event, has to activate the fight, flight, or freeze system. In other words, an event where you just go about your ordinary day, but it's a bad event, it hasn't activated fight, flight, or freeze. That gets activated when we think we are in danger. And for those of you, I'm sure you all know, but our autonomous nervous system has built in for, before human beings were made, a system that allows us to escape harm. And that system has continued to exist as even as human beings have evolved and matured, and it's in all animals. Then one of the things I think is important here, which is not often thought about, is once the trauma happens, it's very difficult to return to the pre-traumatized state or the state of normal if you are in fact traumatized. So I think of it as a splintered glass. You can imagine that to return this glass to the way it was before it was splintered is virtually impossible. You either have to replace it or it has to be repaired in some place. But if you think of a repair, that means it's not the original thing again. Okay. That's just a basic definitional thing I want to talk about. And I want to talk a little bit about, I wrote this out for myself, don't bury the lead. One of the key things I've learned in recent years is we do not get over trauma. It lives in us and it moves forward with us. It means that we've learned that trauma literally transforms who we are. It transforms our brains, it transforms our psychology, it transforms us biologically, and what studies have shown of epigenetics, it can be transmitted to another generation. So in studies of Holocaust survivors, that they have found that their children are traumatized even though they never experienced the trauma of the Holocaust or some other intervening trauma. It means we don't get over it. We try to treat grief and trauma like a calendar event, right? 30 days and we should be done with it, or 60 days or whatever. That simply is not true. That puts a burden on the person who is suffering grief or trauma to conform to some mechanism that just doesn't exist. And I talk a lot in the book about the many times over my life that either my family or others would just tell me to just move on. So I think that an important question as we think about trauma is, how do we learn to live with trauma, and how do we learn to live with trauma in community with others? And that's kind of that rivalry relationship kind of notion. And how do we learn to be with the traumatized other, right? So we can end up in rivalry with them because they're angry at you, so you can be angry at them, and then we just go down the rivalry route, or we can learn something different in terms of the interaction. And when I understood this, I developed more compassion for myself, which was very helpful. And it allows us to have more compassion for the other. So I thought it'd be interesting to actually talk about what I attempted to accomplish in this book, because I don't think there is actually a book just like this. I wanted it to be fast paced. I wanted to read like a mystery or novel. I wanted it to be accessible to both the lay reader and the professional reader. I had picked up too many books that were either kind of memoirs, but boring. Okay, so I said it. But if I really wanted the information out there, I needed people to want to read it. And so I think the most common response I get is, it is compelling and they can't put it down. So if you want a book that's just really compelling, you can't put down, you can pick this one up, okay? And I think some people on the call here could attest to that. It is structured like a memoir, actually spiritual memoir. So each chapter starts with some sort of quote or citation to the Bible, or a poet or a writer. And it's not autobiography, which means it's not organized chronologically, it's organized thematically. And it's organized under what I would call the arc of a life with trauma. So it's divided into 5 sections. First is trauma, like the imposition of trauma, what it looks like for the child, my framework on it, what it looks like with adults who are not, or either imposing the trauma or ignoring the trauma. The faith section is a little bit about how does one end up having some sense of meaning and purpose in one's life. We can use faith as literally meaning a particular faith, or we can use faith as somehow developing a sense of purpose in life. Then, of course, what happens is after trauma, there is the struggle. There is the struggle to live post-trauma or with recurring events that impact the trauma. We know that someone's more likely to be traumatized the more often a bad event happens. So there's an event in the book where I talk about a woman who was in her first, second, third, by the 4th motor vehicle crash. Now she's suffering the impacts of trauma because she's now beginning to wonder what happened to her. She's having flashbacks, nightmares, maybe not the first one or the second one, but the repeated kind of events start to traumatize them. In this book, and I hope for many trauma survivors, there's a period of transition where transition is very, very hard. I'm not going to try to make it's very hard, and it's ongoing, and it requires the involvement both of oneself and getting the right people around you to help you. But transition from what you've become as a traumatized person or adult to what you might become is important and hopeful. And then there's what I call renewal. If it was theological, I'd call it resurrection. If it was in other contexts, I might call it restoration. The ability of one to go back, not to go back to life as they knew it, but to go on with life as it is. I wanted to, this is literary stuff, but show, not tell the experiences of and consequences of trauma. When I'd been a chaplain resident for a year, I'd been to therapy, but I get to this trauma residency and they don't even have a syllabi, because I'm supposed to be learning about trauma in addition to caring for traumatized people. And an important chunk of the book is how I had to learn myself what trauma was, what trauma-informed care was, and I had to learn the mistakes I was making. And one of the things I found out is if you don't understand this and you are caring for other people, whether it's in the context of being even a doctor, I mean, I'm not just talking about the counselor sort of professions or a pastor, you can be very dangerous without understanding that the people we are dealing with, and many of them are coming from a traumatized perspective. I also wanted to do it in this fashion because It is easy to read an academic paper. I found the books and stuff. I took the courses, but that alone, I think, is not the same thing as the experience of being in a room when it really works, both for yourself and for the other. Um, so here's some things I wanted to show and not tell. Um, Traumatized individuals tend to present facades or false narratives about themselves. Um, the first chapter is entitled The Beautiful Facade. And I tell you directly in the first chapter, I put the page number there. My goal was, as an adult, was to deflect, deflect, deflect. And I felt that neglect and abuse were my secrets. Of course, I was told to keep it secret, and I hold them tight like heirlooms locked away in storage. So I rarely, if ever, tell the truth about my childhood. I'm trying to open up the door. This is kind of a literary device that's used in novels, but you need to question whether I'm being reliable, because the problem with trauma is there's some unreliability built in, both from the desire to deny, as you and from the fact that your memory's mucked up. I wanted to have people experience what it's like to have memories that are like mucked up. I don't know a good academic word for it. There are academic words for it, but some of the memories that I put down, I can't put in a full picture. So I wrote, they fly through my brain like faded snapshots. It's like if you got a bunch of snapshots in the olden days and nobody marked what date or who was in the picture, you can't quite put them together into a story or a narrative, and they don't come at you in any particular order. The images are incomplete, or they're in darkness, or even repressed. And I show my experience of somehow coming up with a repressed experience as I was writing the book. All trauma, current trauma, understands that actually we don't have, people who've been traumatized don't have language for the trauma. It's either so horrible, so shameful, or it's induced so much pain that, like, you almost have to go to literature to begin to feel the horrors of war, right? So we lack words for it. So demanding that somebody tell you their trauma story, but they may not have words for it. It's like asking, you're asking somebody who only has images and pictures and repressed memories. They can't put it together in a coherent, or if we hear this all the time, well, the story you're telling doesn't make sense. That's because, and we'll talk about this in a moment, it's not organized in your brain in a sensible manner. It's not only because the trauma doesn't make sense, it's because it is with you in a non-rational fashion. We all know some of them, their anger, their denial, their irritability, there are lashing out, there is withdrawal, there's isolation, there's depression. And that's a list. But how do we really feel that list? And so I wanted to write a book where you could really feel how it plays out. And if you've experienced it directly or indirectly, it would ring true to you. What I wanted to do from the book in terms of content, was I wanted it to be experiential. You're going to get into the story. You're going to feel you're in the middle of the story. Or as some people now, 5 years of writing, I'm glad they say this, but they can't put the story down. They're so compelled by the story. But I think that's a good way to learn. I wanted to cover theology of trauma. Shelley Rambo, who was a professor at Boston University, she talks about the theology of remaining, but basically she puts trauma in between the death and the resurrection, meaning Holy Saturday. And if you're familiar with the Apostles' Creed, in the Apostles' Creed, we talk about Jesus going into hell. Well, if you've been traumatized afterwards, even during and after, you can feel like you're in hell, or like your soul has died, or any metaphor you can think of, because your life's been taken away from you, in a sense, your spirit, your soul, your ability to be free to be yourself. And it is in that period where all literature suggests we need a witness to our trauma. And in fact, if we don't honor the hell, there won't be a resurrection. I can go into that theologically, but if you ever wonder why there's a Holy Saturday, it's not because it was a Sabbath, okay? Because if God could do anything, God could have gotten right back off the cross and walked, right? If you really believe that. So she has a wonderful theology, and I wanted to convey some of it, and it is in the book. I wanted to convey the biology of trauma. Bessel van der Kolk is the best known, he's not the originator of these series, best known for explaining how trauma is embedded in our autonomous nervous system. It's not in our rational brains. We don't perceive trauma when we're being traumatized, and we don't organize it logically and take it in rationally. We go into fight, flight, or freeze. So as a child, you'll see the examples I give of freeze, where I attempted to just sit with my mother, and I thought that as long as I could be silent and sit still, I wouldn't cause her to be mad at me. And if she wanted to ramble for 4 hours, let her ramble for 4 hours. But asking a 10-year-old to sit for 4 hours is almost impossible, but that was always my effort. On the other hand, my sister decided to flee the house. She wanted to go live with my father. She couldn't deal with it. And if we go to theology, if you think about that time of the cross, there's a very theological way we can, traumatized way we can think about it. But what do most of the disciples do? They deny, they fight, sword and all, they flee, and then they hide in the upper room, right? I have a whole little story about Mary Magdalene and some of the others, but that's what they're doing. They're responding to the threat to their lives and to the life of their leader. There was no trauma theology at the time, but they're responding as human beings would to a traumatic event. There's another fellow, Peter Levine. He's very much have talked about one of the things that happens in human beings is we can't discharge the energy that's induced in animals in the deny, fight, flight, because we can't get out of it. If you're a child in a home, you can't really leave the house and escape that trauma. And so it's always lurking over you. And then your body, because it's in your body, it responds later in different ways. So it responds what we call now maladaptive fight, flight, or freeze, right? Anything that reminds you, your system, your nervous system, of the original event will cause you to go into fight, flight, or freeze mode. So that's why, in very simple terms, a combat veteran who is suffering from PTSD because of bombings and shootings and things they had to endure will think that a car backfire or even the slamming of a door, your body takes you back. It's like time travel. It just takes you back to the original event. You have no control over that. And I describe in the book my experience of seeing someone actually slowly have a flashback in daytime. Now, I wanted to talk about the psychology of it. I went to a training by the Arizona Trauma Institute. I learned all sorts of things, but now we really understand ACEs. It's Adverse Childhood Experiences Score. It has studied and listed a number of experiences that if as a child you had them, you are statistically more likely to be involved in have chronic disease, like diabetes, high blood pressure, and chronic sort of anxiety or chronic depression as a result of those experiences. There's also a process of what we would call approaching someone who's been traumatized. That's Judith Herman talks about it, and it's been explored in many ways, which is We need to create safety for the traumatized individual. And however you create that safety, that's the only way they will be able to have what we might call a period of mourning. That's sitting in the Holy Saturday. It's recognizing that it's hell. As an aside, I always thought after uh, the shooting in the nightclub, where the LGBTQ nightclub in Orlando, and in many other times, we go from trauma to strong. That does us no good. You have to have the grief in between, and you have to witness to the grief, and you have to acknowledge it. Because I remember it was Orlando Strong, like the next day. Well, you've just taken out of the picture literally hundreds of people and saying to them, your feelings afterwards, your crying, your flashbacks, your nightmares are not going to be acknowledged. And that causes more harm. There is EMDR, eye movement desensitization. I don't know if I spelled that right, and reprocessing. There are newer techniques other than talk therapy to help people in accounting for and dealing with trauma. And then there's the recovery. You know you're on the road to recovery when you begin those first signs of self-compassion. Recovery can be aided by different forms of therapy. I mean, you have to get your symptoms under control. That's the first thing that everybody talks about. You don't have to, in old time talk therapy, go to the event and recount the event as if it's some neurosis you need to talk out of yourself. Before you can feel safe, you have to minimize the nightmares and the flashbacks and the irritability and the triggers that cause you to be angry all the time. Then there's the ability to move into forgiveness, love, and hope, which is the last part of the book. These lessons that I've learned are also lessons that can help us in our relationships with one another, and can reduce our sense that we must be in competition with somebody else, and rather extend our open-heartedness to be in relationship with someone else. So how do you avoid re-traumatizing somebody and making them feel safe? Do not make the individual tell their trauma. So in chapter 9, as part of chaplain training, we had to undergo a mock sort of board certification questions. And for some reason, these people on the board said I wasn't telling them something. I'm like, what am I not telling you? I had mentioned in my written materials that there had been problems in my childhood. And they sat there and they were not going to be satisfied until I told them about the trauma. And that I was shaking so badly and things like that. But there's always a silver lining. And that's where I discovered Henry Nouwen and the Wounded Healer. You also want to recognize that there are triggers out there in the world that will smell, hearing, sight, sound, words, postures, the makeup of a room. Anything can trigger a traumatized person to respond in an irrational way. Hospitals are highly triggering atmospheres. So true trauma-informed care means that from ground up, you build a system that reduces noise, gives the patient some control over their time in the hospital, give people the opportunity to tell their story when they're ready to tell their story, and if they even need to tell the story. There are some theories out there that if you can control the symptomology, then you don't need to talk about the trauma, because what's really interfering with your ability to live in life are all these symptoms, you know. And understanding that sometimes when you're facing a person who's just unbelievably angry, and I've been that person. I haven't understood why I'm so angry. I think I know why I'm angry, but it's always more than that. to maybe take a second and realize there's something else going on here. I don't need to figure it out, but maybe just I take it down a notch, and then they will model me and they will take it down a notch, because engaging with the fight at that point only accelerates the fight. And the reason this is important is because the trauma reaction, since it's emotional and in our autonomic nervous system, it's faster than our rational brain. So suggesting that someone use their rational brain to control their trauma reaction is illogical neurologically, because your nervous system is going to respond way faster than your brain can get online. It's like waiting for the computer to turn on, and you already like, I need to know the answer. We can't wait for our rational brain. We act too fast. And so throughout the book, I identify my effort to discover my triggers and learning to live with the triggers and learning to understand that I'm still going to get triggered. Even after writing the book, after doing all this, there are days when I'm going to be irritable, I'm going to be cranky, and I am more able to be more forgiving of myself and try again the next day, whether it's mindfulness, prayer, walking, exercise, therapy, whatever it is, to again try to reassert some control over my reactivity. Um, there's a lot of disorientation and dislocation that can trigger trauma response. I'm talking about not the trauma itself, and can be traumatizing. So imagine a hospital. You are taken there in an emergency condition. Your clothes are taken away from you. You're placed in a room that you're not familiar with. There are people talking to you and asking personal questions that you don't know. They're poking and prodding your body without necessarily asking permission, because that doesn't always make sense. The worst thing I kept seeing in the hospitals, and this is such a simple thing, they will barge in on a patient anytime, day or night. They might knock for a second, but no one's trying to think through, how can I enter this room and be least disruptive to this person? So they've lost control over every aspect of their life. And if you don't think that's not traumatizing, it is. And it seems to me it's one of the simpler fixes that we could do. So this happens anytime we are disoriented. And also learning to understand denial and deflection. Now, this is a skill, but if you understand that traumatized people deflect and create false narratives, and you're trying to help them, you need to recognize what is a false narrative versus the true narrative. And I'm going to give you an easy example. If I go into a room and the patient is dying and the family is crying, and I ask them, I understand it's a bad situation, you want to tell me how you are? And they say, I'm okay. That's not true. The I'm okay is the deflection and the denial, right? They feel like they're not supposed to be upset or cry, because that's what we, at least in American culture, have imposed upon our culture. And that they're not, even if they are, they're not supposed to talk about it. And even if they could talk about it, our individualized society says they should be able to take care of it themselves. So the experienced or skilled person will say, I hear you, but how are you really feeling? Or, that's great, but I don't think so. Like, you learn ways to ask them to go one more step, and a way to convey to them that it is safe to go that other step with you. And it might not be in that moment. It might be when you get them in a hall later or by themselves. But if you create a sense of safety and you recognize what is a deflection, you can actually really help people a great deal. And so these are things to learn about human beings. Like, I was a prosecutor attorney, I had to learn how to identify the facts that were central to proving the case. I didn't know what to look for as a chaplain. I'm like, what am I looking for? But over time, I learned how to figure out, just like a fact finder, clues to a person's emotional state. or clues to how they were really feeling without them telling me what it was, right? That's when you become fairly skilled at that practice. And a lot of it I understood instinctively. Let me go see what the next. So, what did I learn instinctively here? One is we come at other people. This is part of safety. We come at other people trying to be non-anxious. Okay. Going into a room where the person, as I say in the book, on the other side is dying is a highly anxiety producing thing. Don't care who you are, whether you're the chaplain or the doctor. I've sat with doctors outside rooms and they don't really want to go in and convey the bad news, right? It's highly anxious. So we have to learn, and probably as pastors and counselors, how to present in a non-anxious way. I started to use the hand washing system as a way to do that. As I try to clear my mind as I walk down a hall, but when I got in front of the room, you always had to wash your hands. So I took that as a moment to really almost like tapping or touching, to take that moment to clear my head and to try to clear any anxiety before I went in. We have to get rid of our facades, and this is kind of a now in theology, but now in The Wounded Healer talks about the reason that in early training, a chaplain student could not resonate with a man who was about to, in the 60s. So they were about to amputate his leg or legs, and he was a farmer and lived alone, and just how terrible that was for him. And the student complained later to Nowin that the man, he couldn't make way with the man because the man was cranky and unhappy. And Nowin uses this to expose something that we really need to know. And I think it's also part of what Rebecca talks about in positive mimesis, and I can go into that later if you want me to. But what I had to learn was when I enter a room, I am not a lawyer. I am not a trained chaplain. I have not any theology degree. I don't know better than anybody else, because what I'm there to do is to step with the person into their painful situation. I have to feel that I too am at risk to really have the healing, to create the safety and have the resonance with the patients. But that's also part of presence, right? Non-anxious is not enough. We really kind of have to rid ourselves of who we are so that we, as Nowin says in his example, the student knew that he was going home at the end of the day, that he had a family, that he would soon be over his chaplain internship, and he went into the room knowing that. So of course he couldn't relate to the man. But if you can get rid of that, it allows us to be one human being to another, is what I would say. We start to realize that the other person is just a person if we remove their facades, and I'm just a person. And what theology or trauma practice or just being good human beings is, we relate to each other as fellow human beings. And of course, the book, in terms of structure, was oriented always from the beginning to get to the transformational story that's located near the end of the book, about my ability to go into a locked hospital room, I couldn't get out, with a blind, suicidal, psychotic man. And I sat next to him. We sang hymns. And it's probably that event that made me want to write the book, because we talk about how bad people are all the time. And we talk about the world as no things. No, we don't see the good in people. But in that moment, nobody in the world knew that that transformational moment took place. And it takes place a lot between human beings, when human beings are being really true, genuine, good-hearted human beings. And we don't get to see it. So part of the purpose of the book was, I just wanted someone to see it. I want you to know what chaplains do, or good pastors do, or good counselors do. And it's really quite amazing. Okay. We have to reorient ourselves to the suffering of others. That's both what Shelley Rambo says. The disciples had to reorient themselves to the suffering of Jesus. He doesn't just show Thomas his hands and feet, although that has been the traditional biblical narrative. He shows it to the first group. He goes, peace be with you. And he shows them his hands and his feet. And then he says, peace be with you again. And what one can deduce from that is that he had changed and he brought his wounds with him into the next resurrected life. And that's what a traumatized person does, even in their resurrection. They never go back to the glasses the way it was. They bring their wounds forward into the life. And I suggest that the disciples could not take care of others until they were willing to recognize others' woundedness. Okay. And we must enter the room with a genuine desire to connect, rather than, as in Girardian theory, we tend to say there's a universal desire to compete, to possess, to conquer, to overcome the other. And that we need to have rivalry. And there's a bunch of other things that flow from that, but we don't have to do that. We can work, and it's hard work. You can work on yourself. You can work on your desire to be in real connection with people, or as I lived a lot of my life with the desire not to connect with people because I was so friggin' afraid of other people and didn't trust them. But that's when we can create meaningful relationships. That's when we can enter into sort of almost a mimicry or reciprocity rather than rivalry. And sometimes one of us has to model that to the other, or sometimes we have to model the other who's doing it for us. And if we operate from an abundance rather than a scarcity model, right? I'm doing podcasts now, and I just did one on generosity and abundance rather than scarcity model. This is all counterintuitive to the world as we see it through the lens of the news today, but we also have to witness. A traumatized person needs a witness, needs someone to say yes, and that's it. Yes. We don't need someone to say get over it, or it wasn't as bad as you thought it was. I remember early in a chaplain internship thing, I said something about my father, and another intern immediately said, I'm sure your father still loved you. Well, that sounded right, but it was minimizing my experience of my father, right? It was telling me how I should feel, or that it couldn't have been. It really was a statement of it really wasn't as bad as you seem to think it was, right? You have to be very careful about that. And the other thing is to let the victim control the narrative. Nobody has to tell you their shit. Sorry, to use very academic language. But if they want to, let them tell it as they want to tell it and let it unfold naturally. But what all trauma theory says, what Shelley Rambo says in this theology of remaining, is we need a witness. And I think for some reason, I talk about the therapists I have later in life, and I mean, she may have been the first time that she sort of said, stop, I believe you. I believe you. It happened. Stop trying to pretend it didn't happen. It did. Right. I needed someone else to stop all the maneuvers I was making to pretend it didn't happen and to comport with the myth that it didn't happen and everybody was fine in my family and all that kind of stuff. And that witnessing, yes, it did happen. Your feelings really are in proportion to what happened to you, right? That's another thing, but you don't need to get all mad about it. No, you do, That's really important in how we relate to other people. Meaning making, people need to make sense of things. What I learned in the hospital through someone who's in a bad traumatic event, whether it's a shooting, a motorcycle accident, something like that, I could tell whether they were heading towards sort of a feeling traumatized or feeling differently. And there was one key thing they would say. Why did this happen to me? I learned that those are the people to worry about. because they're struggling with a sense of meaning and purpose. Like, why, right? They've lost all sense of their purpose and their meaning. The folks who said, look at me, I survived. And there were people all the time telling me, I'm going to testify at my church to the survival. It's like a miracle. I didn't worry about that because they were already reconstructing the event in a way that they wanted to testify or move into the future with the event, right? So that seems very simple, but I probably could have done a study and issued a research paper, but nobody would read it and it wouldn't matter. So to the extent we can also, as people who work in fields that are to help others or where we interact with people who are traumatized, we can help them reframe and reconstruct a sense of purpose. Again, the book gives some examples of that. There's a prisoner who ends up in the hospital when he has a seizure and it's discovered, he's not even 30, it's discovered he has a glioblastoma in his head, basically a tumor that's terminal. And he's the only person I ever asked, would he like to be baptized? I baptize people who ask me to baptize them. And in the course of, he asked me to send him some passages from the Bible. But in the baptism itself, he said, and there were some doctors that came into witnesses. We always try to make this an event, just like you would if it was your family. And there, he turned to the doctors and he said, I am healed. He knew he wasn't healed. He wasn't cured. Nobody was expecting a miracle. What he was saying is, I feel loved now in a way I didn't when I was that gangster guy on the street. And that's also a powerful thing. So when we talk to people, don't start with their weaknesses. That's what chaplains are taught to do, which is one of my revolts against chaplaincy sometimes is, find their grief point. Make sure you're willing to talk about death with them. See if they're angry, see if they're whatever. They wanted you to identify the weakness. And if you didn't do that, you'd fail. But you can't make someone feel safe if you go directly to their weakness. So I listen for their strengths. They love baseball. It gives them a sense of purpose and meaning. Or they're really good at, chess. Or they're very faithful. I mean, it's not always about faith, but it's what gives them a sense of purpose for getting up in the morning, and go to that. And use that as a way to say, you're pretty strong. I know you're sitting in that bed and you're not feeling well, but boy, you want to watch that baseball game, don't you? Let's talk about that, right? As a chaplain, you kind of have to learn to use different ways to get inside someone, but that was a quick way. The real way, and it's now in Wounded Healers, the real way you create safety and security is telling someone, I hear you, and I'm not leaving you. And I will be with you. I will journey alongside you, not in front of you, telling you how to go, or not behind you, not understanding you. That's how I envision it. It's right alongside. So as a lawyer, I was trained to be ahead of them and clear out the paths and find the issues and take care of it for the other person so they can get through the event. Sometimes as human beings, we don't understand what the person is saying. So we're actually lagging behind them. And what I like to think about is I was really calibrated. When I was good, I was calibrated to journey at the same pace as them. I'm not fixing them and I'm not misunderstanding them. I don't know if that makes sense, but we can talk about it. When you can do all of those things, there is the possibility of new life after the death caused by trauma. In some ways, I think I have been the beneficiary of having that chance at a new life. I am not making more money than I used to make. I have trouble with my jobs at times. But Nouwen's other book, Beloved, once you understand or ground yourself in a sense of love that doesn't require it from other people, but you're securing it as part of your creation, then the world isn't such an anxiety-inducing place. And it takes therapy and a lot of other stuff. Okay, I'm making it sound simple, but I can tell you what it feels like. Okay. Uh, and then, I talk at the end of the book, but the arch of love. I had to struggle, but found a place where love could both be shared, a place for forgiveness. I found that I had overcome my fear so much that in the end, uh, in a remarkable turn of events, I had the chance to experience the ability to forgive my mother, and my mother asked for forgiveness, saying she was sorry. And then, of course, there's the faith and the hope. When we nurture our faith, a positive faith, a faith that believes in love, that believes in possibilities, that believes in hope, that um, understands that suffering is part of life. It's not a thing that is a false prosperity gospel or a judgmental gospel or whatever. There is the possibility of moving forward. And that's where faith can kind of, whatever your faith is, what they call a positive faith. There's all sorts of literature and research on it, but um, it can be very helpful. And that's how the story ends. And I'll just tell you one more thing. People always thought the book was about chaplaincy. It probably wasn't. I wasn't conveying it because I said I'm starting from sort of my experience as a chaplain. Whether it's an older person who just wanted to read a book or whatever, there's not a single person who hasn't said that that book resonated and they were glad they read it. That's pretty remarkable. Now, I haven't sold 1,000,000 of them, okay? So I'm not talking about 1,000,000 responses, but or even 1,000. But it's really turned out to be a book that many people can pick up, and I'm glad for that. Okay, your turn, January.
Sounds good. And we've got some great questions here. I just wanted to ping Andrew real quick since you just mentioned the book. This would be a great time for those links again for anyone who wasn't here earlier and didn't see them. I want to make sure that people have a chance to get their hands on that book because it is wonderful. Andrew blessed me with a copy, and I've read it twice now, and we'll be reading it again and recommending it to others as well. So the first question that we had was from Jane, and she was curious, was your chaplaincy training clinical pastoral education, or did it come some other way?
No, it was clinical pastoral education. And in my usual way that I overdo things, my addiction or my compensation was I always had to do things hard and in the long way. So the CPE, clinical pastoral education, as an intern, as a resident, and then I took a second year of residency to specialize in trauma. Does that help?
Jane, give us a thumbs up if that answered the question. Great. Wes wanted to know, you describe in the chapter entitled Seminary, your entry into seminary as one where you could not find your purpose almost throughout your entire time.
Mm-hmm.
This was vastly different compared to your journey to become a lawyer. How did you navigate that uncertainty and open-ended journey?
Oh, well, I think first the open-endedness started when I adopted my daughter. And that's a big, bold step. But I always thought even when I went to seminary, I still thought I was still practicing as a lawyer. I thought it would be a theological exploration. Um, even today, like today, I'm like, come on, folks, you lawyers, I'll go over there and be a lawyer and straighten it out for you. The instinct, the control was, and the need for me to have a sense of purpose probably saved my life, but it was controlled. I wanted to be a lawyer. I knew what I'd do as a lawyer, et cetera, et cetera. The open-endedness has always been hard, but I would think about it, and there came a point in Indiana I was not happy as a lawyer, but I saw that my daughter was happy, and so I think it was learning to listen to God, even if that sounds very religious, but learning to listen to the spirit of something that's telling you to go a certain direction and learning to trust it and learning it's kind of this Merton true north versus magnetic north. Even after seminary, there's a great magnetic north I want to head towards that sounds more like who I think I'm destined to be. And then there's the true north, which is time and again God wanted me somewhere in a hospital with a patient, in secret, no publicity, no, dramatic courtroom scenes. And I began to trust that, I think. Yeah.
I would love to know more about how did you learn to make that distinction between what was the magnetic north and what was the true north? What did that feel like to you?
Um, I've always had sort of a gift of knowingness, which is a kind of an odd way to say it, but uh, uh, it's usually sort of a peacefulness. But sometimes I've had to just say, stop looking around, right? Which is what I tend to do, right? And pay attention to what's literally in front of you. What does God literally put in front of you? Like, He put in front of me my daughter, right? So I have to take care of her, right? And that's what God wants me to do. God has literally, through seminary, placed me in a hospital in chaplaincy. So I need to do it. But each time I do it, I'm like, this kind of resonates with me, right? Or there would be a weird day where I go to the hospital and it's like something happens in the room with a patient that tells me I was supposed to meet that patient and God wanted me to. I was the person that the patient needed to meet. I was, right? And then there's the larger one, like there's a bazillion lawyers out there, but how many people can be a chaplain that can go talk to people who are dying in the most stressful circumstances? We're not even counselors, right? It's counselors see people after the traumatic event, and God bless them. I mean, they've been helpful, but um, when you're literally in that crisis and maybe you need someone who's been trained as a lawyer, so there's the ability to control, there's just some things. And I think that's it. Uh, there's signs. Sometimes I sit with a patient, the patient would say something to me that could actually talked about something that I've been thinking about. So I always thought it's a two-way street. But there's a knowingness. I don't want to say comfort, but it's a knowingness. And it's a knowing that every time I've turned elsewhere, it didn't work for some reason. It's not smooth sailing. I don't know how to describe it, but um, it requires a lot of reflection. It's not easy. You have to reflect. Sometimes you have to go be mad about the fact that God doesn't have you where you want to be. And you just plain have to express that, right? And sometimes you just go, okay.
Yeah. And it sounds like a lot of presence to what's actually in front of us instead of all the stories that we've told ourselves or inherited from culture
Mm-hmm,
or
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
whatever. Yeah.
Exactly.
Well, I said another question. In the chapter on dislocation and disorientation, you describe how disorientating it is for patients and families with a loss of routine, the familiar, and add into that the plethora of new language, acronyms, and rules in the hospital system. How does that help in the midst of the trauma of hospitalization, catastrophe, emergency, etc.?
It doesn't. That I think that's part of the book is kind of its own expose, right? I am critical. I don't even say a little. I'm critical of hospital systems because and I say this a couple of times in the book, um, the hospitals are modern technological miracles, right? You can stand and watch the surgeons in the trauma bay, and they will get a heart to beat, and they will get the lungs to breathe, and they will. I describe in the book. I've watched them open a chest, right, to put a breathing tube in there. They can get you back, your body functioning, but their attention to spirit care, soul care. I don't even want to call it religious care, but the spiritual health of the individual is abysmal, even in the best ones. So, for example, we've had patients that come in, they are desperate need of psychiatric help, but they have high blood pressure, so they had a heart attack. They will not get psychiatric care until they fix that heart problem. They won't send them to the psychiatric unit. They won't send a counselor to talk to them. So often it's a chaplain who might go into that space. If someone has just come from a car crash, can you imagine what it's like to be in a room where the bells are dinging in the hallway and the lights are flashing? In Methodist Hospital, where I was, it was still an older building. So you had those nursing lights that are flashing outside every single door. You have announcements of codes overhead, and you have the dinging of the various machines telling nurses to come into the room or not. And you're still suffering under the shock of the incident. It's not helpful, and hospitals are not making room for it. In fact, I think hospitals are getting worse because this. I've talked over the last year or two with I trained residents and fellows who are going through the hospital when they rotate through palliative care, and I am, they confirmed again and again that sometimes when they choose to have a difficult conversation, when they just choose to make the family make a decision about a patient, it's not based on when is the best time to approach them. It's based on time on their schedule. So repeatedly, an oncologist or surgeon would go in at 7 o'clock in the morning, wake up a patient, tell them bad news, and leave the room and not come back and talk to the family, leaving the patient with no one around. They don't call I'm just giving you examples, right? They don't call a chaplain. And then the family comes and hears it from the patient, and they're just freaked out, right? So that's what I mean by a system that is not at all organized to take care of us as human beings. And I will tell you that it makes a difference. And not to bore you all, but here's where it makes a difference. Patients don't cooperate with the medical people. They don't trust them, right? So if you do things to add to the distrust, you can have an uncooperative patient on your hands. And if they're uncooperative, they won't get the medicines they need, or they won't take them at the time they need to take it. Or we were always called to the bedside of someone who was refusing care. And if you backstepped it all the way, there was a loss of trust at some point. Now, if you start instead with making sure there's a chaplain and a social worker, and that you're maybe bringing in medical experts who know how to talk to people, and you do this in a timely fashion, and you work to build trust. Don't say you're coming back and don't come back. That person will in turn believe your medical information, and therefore more likely to accept the treatments you're offering, and more likely to cooperate with the physical therapist. I mean, there's all sorts of really big emerging field of research. How do chaplains help? So I'm telling you anecdotally, but it's true. It just is. That cooperative aspect, the calming them down, and families can't hear medical information. I was trying to train everybody I had the chance to train to say, if the family has started to cry while you're telling them the bad news that their loved one is not going to make it, and they're all crying, is that really the time to ask them whether they want their family member to be what they call coded, to give them life-saving support or not? Now, the doctor doesn't want to do that. But if you ask them while they're crying, they're going to say, yes, I want that, right? Because they don't even get it. So anyway, I could write a whole different book about that. But yes, I kind of think that there is really a big problem there. And in life, right? We create difficult situations for ourselves and others. I have.
Definitely guilty of that one myself. Absolutely. Yeah. Wes also asked, as I recall my time in CPE, talk therapy was standard operating procedure. Given the stereotypes that label those who suffer from trauma, difficult, angry, destructive, anti-authoritarian, unfriendly, strange, what is the most effective way forward with those who suffer trauma? And the follow-up, he's read Van der Kolk's The Body Keeps the Score, and how have you experienced the effectiveness of EMDR?
Okay, so these are really two different questions.
Okay.
I think that I'm going to rephrase this as, if this is not right, Wes, just let me know. But that for those of you familiar with clinical pastoral education, basically they say that this is a training. Almost anybody who intends to be ordained in a religious organization must go into a hospital or hospice and be ministers to ill people. And there's a special training, but it's not uniform. But the general model of CPE training is that they put you in a room half day a week, and you just sit there and you have to talk to your fellow chaplains, and you're supposed to talk about your feelings. I remember when I was applying for the second year of residency in the trauma, and they asked me, well, why do you want to do this? And what do you like about chaplaincy? I said something. And then they said, what don't you like about chaplaincy? I said, I don't know why we have to talk about our feelings all the time. So I don't know. They hired me anyway. So anyway, it is a difficult model, and I think it needs to be reformed. And they would ask in job interview questions to have people tell about their trauma. And one, besides the illegality that just blows my mind, because that's really a health thing, right? You're not supposed to inquire about health, but this is that creating situations where you are forcing people to talk about themselves rather than setting up a more natural situation where people will feel free to get to that subject or not. Yeah, it's Stephen. Actually, there's an article that I read as a first-year chaplain that brought me down that whole path. But once you learn trauma-informed care, you realize how bad that model is, and it's a dangerous model. And that's why a lot of people do not make it or want to be chaplains, because it so intimidates. And oh, Jane, okay, yeah, look that up. I think we had at least another chaplain online, Rick Cruz. I know he's there earlier, but he can chime in if he likes in the chat, but that's my view.
Yeah, it sounds like a really important distinction between demanding that someone share their trauma or their story versus inviting them to share their trauma and their story, like by making a space in which they feel invited and safe to do that.
Right. Exactly.
So then the follow-up, how have you experienced the effectiveness of the EMDR?
So EMDR, for me, as I explained, the book was kind of a last resort. So EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, it was invented. It was not invented. It was discovered by accident. I think her name was Francine. I can't remember her last name. But it had to do with this motion back and forth, right? Because, you know, with trauma, your trauma is not embedded rationally in whatever. So it was first found to be very, very effective for what we would call one incident trauma, where you've been traumatized by a singular incident. And you can usually get to it very quickly, because otherwise you are pretty much a non-anxious, not depressed, whatever, and suddenly this thing happens to you and you can't get over it, right? So it didn't take a long time to maybe develop trust with whoever you were going to do this engagement with, and to be willing to undergo that process. It has somewhat been decided that for repeated trauma, repeated events of, neglect, abuse, or whatever, it's not necessarily the best, because one of the things you have to. So what EMDR, as I experienced it, is that it's not like talk therapy, because I could recite the facts of my life, even the bad facts, without any emotional attachment to the facts, right? And so I could do that all day long. Yeah. EMDR tries to get you to re-experience the emotion of the event, because that's what's disconnected from your rational system. So you have to kind of pick an event or memory. There's a lot of preparation for the actual experience. I don't know that all therapists do it, but a lot of we tried everything else to kind of reduce reactivity. we found that I was very, very defended against feeling the feelings, even when I went back in my mind in the event. And you don't recount it to the person that's watching you. You just re-experience it in your head. I was very, very unwilling to re-experience emotions. So it took a long time. But then I did. But I also, in the experience of the emotion, stayed with it long enough to figure in my head, kind of literally rechange the narrative that I could escape the situation. That's, wisdom, adult, whatever. But by re-experiencing and connecting what they think the emotion to the actual event, now that emotion isn't flying all over the place, showing up at the wrong time in the wrong place. Okay. Does that make sense? That's how I experience it. So you've now attached that. So, and you've resolved it rationally. So what I found was it was not what they talk about. Like there's this big benefit, and the next day I was a changed person. Over time, I did find that my reactivity had diminished. My ability to, having reframed some of the critical narrative, it didn't haunt me in my dreams like it was. Right? It did have a good effect, but part of that was also being with somebody who was a good counselor, who did all the right steps pre, did all the right steps post, and allowed me to finally feel safe enough to feel that. But that's kind of how I view it, is you're trying to tie the emotion to the event. So it's not rambling around looking for whenever it can escape, right? So does that make sense? So I think it can benefit, but I think it's just one of many tools. But it is right now maybe the one of the, I'm not going to say best, but a tool that can be very effectively used to reduce reactivity and the symptoms of trauma.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Thank you. Rick had an observation that Van der Kolk says that trauma does not return as a memory, but as an experience.
Mm-hmm.
And I had a question that was connected to that,
Mm-hmm.
where because the experience of trauma isn't coded in language, it's coded in that visceral experience. Can you talk
Right.
a little more about the challenge of writing a book that's trying to get at something via language that isn't language based?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. It's very hard. It's hard, right? And it took a lot. Well, first of all, I first had to figure out what the real experience was versus what would often come up as the first draft, right? Which was cranky, and I had a point of view, and I was trying to prove something to somebody, which is exactly what I didn't want to do, right? So I often had to continue to work at it. And I think in the book, I'll call it, the stories have to reflect off of each other, right? Then in a way, you're reading in between the stories. It's the feeling that the stories reflecting off of each other can regenerate in the person reading it, right? So people will cry when they read this book, right? I don't tell them to cry, right? I just kind of relate them. And then it was very hard to figure out what stories to tell and what not to tell, right? And what story went with another story. What was really interesting is I had these stories to tell. There was a time when I would think this story goes with this story, even though they seem utterly unrelated. And I didn't understand why the story went with the story. But if I worked on it hard enough, like even just like, okay, I got to the point where I knew there would be like 3 stories per chapter somehow. What order, there's the get you into the chapter, there was the learning, and then there was the reflection, right? And sometimes that would be 3 different stories. So if you go to the story, the chapter that's probably most telling is soul murder. In that one, I tell a story about encountering a domestic violence victim as a chaplain early in my trauma. I tell a story about, which does sound related, a story of having prosecuted someone for killing somebody, their spouse, and disappearing the body, never to be found. But I needed that story to reflect why I was being how I was in the encounter. So I was going present, past, and then pass. And then I tell a story that comes to me while I'm writing the chapter about kind of the ultimate event that made me be silent, right? Not have words. But I think when the three stories are put together, they create something else. So that's the part, that's the literature part. I studied it, I tried to find techniques, and sometimes I went by instinct, and I wrote and rewrote and rewrote and rewrote. Okay. But it was the reflecting of the stories on the stories. The way sometimes a novel can tell a truth that a direct recounting of something can't. Hope that answers the question.
Yeah, definitely. And I can relate to that too, where when I went through my own trauma, the avenue that I found was fiction because I could put everything into metaphors.
Mm-hmm.
I told everybody that everything in this book is fiction except the feelings.
Right, right, right.
So George had a question. I've read that cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, is highly effective in treating trauma-related conditions. Do you have any experience with CBT?
I have a little experience. I've read a lot about CBT in the context. It is effective, but what the really trauma informed perspective is that you can't start CBT. So in this training I went to, he literally talked about the intake sheet, right? If the intake sheet for CBT tells you to tell them the traumatic event that they need to work on, then you've already kind of defeated some of it because you're not supposed to force people to tell. So if it's put in the right environment, it's highly effective. It's used with veterans a lot. And obviously it's also effective because it helps reduce symptomology, but it is a rational base. It's cognitive, right? And to some extent, trauma has to be expelled emotionally, and not with just learned behaviors, because our learned behaviors can't account for every possible trigger that we have, which is why they often now find mindfulness and breathing exercises and somatic and tapping and all these bodily interactions, yoga, may be a little better. But they will say, and studies show it is effective, yes.
Yeah, Andrew had a great question. He says, in your book, it's clear that ministering to others can be very helpful in beginning to recognize our own trauma. Is there an inverse or downside to the ministerial role, perhaps especially for those who do it professionally? Can the focus on helping others be a shield against or deflection away from becoming aware of our own trauma?
Yes, of course it can. And that's, being a prosecutor deflected me from my own trauma. But I got to face people who were victims of violent crime or extortions or caught up in a gang or whatever. But the system of being a lawyer, right? I would listen to people all the time. I was actually quite good with witnesses. And I think that empathy kind of carried through, but there was a logic to lawyering, and I wasn't supposed to get emotionally involved with the witness, right? I needed to figure out how to get them to tell me the story. So that idea of trust. But it's really, are you going to be a workaholic in whatever profession you do? Like use the work to cover your feelings. And you can do that as a prosecutor. You can do that as a business person. You can do that as a chaplain. And you can be a chaplain without ever being what I experience as you can be a chaplain who is considered a very adequate chaplain who goes in, asks them what faith they are. Would you like to pray? What would you like me to pray for? Pray for the person, bring them a Bible, and leave the room. And that's considered fairly standard practice. The more modern practice, where they're talking about being a spiritual provider as opposed to a chaplain, which has all of its religious things, ask us to do a little more, right? Not to be reactive, not to just go to people who want you to pray, but to really sit with people and be present to their pain, and take time with them. So I forget what the original question was. I think I'm sort of answering it, but yes, of course, any profession you can hide behind it. Or you can run from it. And I be honest, there are rooms I ran from. I didn't want to go in there, right? And I could do that, right? Or there are days where I had enough assessment of myself to know that I shouldn't be going into rooms, right? I can do my administrative work. I can go see the person who just wants a prayer, but there are also days when I could turn anything, an encounter in an elevator, into a chaplain exchange. And that's when I thought it was my best days, right? It was just great. And I learned that from an old chaplain at Methodist. But yeah, workaholism. Yeah.
Yeah. So many tools to avoid and numb out.
Yes. Yes. Absolutely.
Yeah. In that same theme of denial and deflection, you said that part of your job is to recognize the untruth when someone is denying or deflecting. Can you speak a little more to the tension between honoring someone's experience exactly as it is and challenging the lies that trauma is selling them about the world?
It's a delicate thing. Um, Sometimes it requires several visits. You know, every chaplain has a story where the person wouldn't even talk to them. They're like, I don't need a chaplain. I don't want a chaplain. But you might come back and just keep making sure you're available. And then one day they need you, right? So that's that availability piece. Um, there's a lot of wisdom that has to come. It sounds very religious, say the Holy Spirit's talking, but sometimes you have to be so in the moment, but also, you don't get in the moment and know what to say by not doing anything on the outside. You have to keep up with your readings. You have to. I used to write down Bible verses because as a Catholic, I didn't memorize Bible verses. I didn't necessarily know what it said, but I'd learn words and I'd study and I'd think about things afterwards. And chaplain training requires you to review your encounters and things like that. Hi, Rick. Good. Um, he was my buddy all through chaplaincy. But that you trust that in that moment, something will come to you that will allow you to say the right word at the right transition at the right time to help them see. So in the book, there's the lady with the motor vehicle crash. It's her fourth one. She's in her 50s or 60s. She has to keep work. She's single, but she has to keep the job, but she has to drive to the job. And she's petrified, right? But she's worried that God is punishing her, right? So that's a myth, right? Bad things happen to bad people, right? That's a biblical myth. That's sort of a trauma myth. You made me mad, right? So I had to hit you, right? That kind of thing. And so what I learned to do, which is often what I do not do in real life, and I certainly didn't do as a lawyer, is I have to wait and wait and keep my mouth shut and wait and wait. And then when I really think I have a sense of, I'm doing these spiritual assessments kind of in my head. I talk about that in the book. And so in this case, I affirmatively in my head, I'm trying to think of a way to convince her that this isn't about punishment. And so I came up with the story of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. I said, Jesus is crying. He's begging that this not happen to him, but he's crying. It hurts. And none of us believe that God did not love his son. Like, one of the things I wanted to say about theology is my view of theology, and we're always trying to see if something fits within this theological box or that theological box or whatever. I'm not going to talk about public theology. I'm going to talk about practice theology. Theology has to meet the moment, unless you want to be an academic and live in an academic tower. And theology is best when it meets the moment. So one could quibble with me about using that. But I lifted up something that I in a way, that I knew she was Catholic, she would get it, right? And once I did that, she's like, oh, oh, oh. And the myth dissipated, right? There's also myths about baptism, right? And this is where I talk about theology has to be practiced. Protestant theology is baptism. It's more like confirmation, as Catholics would know it. A person has to be able to say, I believe in God, I believe in Jesus Christ, I believe in his son, I believe all these I believes, and they have to say it themselves. And And after that, you'll baptize them, and then they will have been accepted into the body of Christ. Well, I hear this chaplain, he's a resident, he's going, I can't baptize a person. He's in a coma. He can't. I'm like, time out. Wait a minute. I'll go baptize the person. Okay. This story isn't in the book, but I go up there, and now I just mix theologies. They said, we were originally Catholic. He was a young man with some intellectual disabilities. He'd been hit by a car. He was never going to come out of this coma. He was going to die, right? The people who needed the baptism was not him. It was the family, right? So I said, okay, here's what I'll do. And I did what you would do for an infant baptism. You're the godfather, you're the godmother, you will speak on behalf of the person, and we'll go through the baptism, right? So it would have done no good for me to stand on some ground that, some theological ground, because that was not my job. And what I learned later was a family member who I had not met, but these are always sad stories, but we stayed in the room. I think they extubated him and waited for the young man to die. Me and another chaplain stayed, but a family member pulled me aside and told me that he wanted to thank me for baptizing the young man because it made his aunt or whoever and the family much more able to deal with the death, knowing that the young man was saved. Now, from my point of view, the young man was saved regardless of the ritual of water or not. So that's my new universalism sort of, but he had never done anything wrong to, but theology is at its best when we can use it to help other people in a way that's, I drifted off the question, but it was something I wanted to say.
Yeah, and all of that was important. Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Lee had more of a comment than a question, but Lee said Peter Levine says that trauma is what happens inside us in the absence of an empathic witness.
Mm-hmm.
And
mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really crucial.
Yes, it is. It is. That need to be witnessed to in a genuine sense, right? Be witnessed to.
And
Absolutely.
Jane also had one that was just more of a comment, but I want to make sure it gets on the recording because we won't see
Okay,
the
go
chat on
ahead.
that. And she was just commenting that she loved Nouwen's book, Beloved.
Oh,
And
yeah.
I did as well.
Mhm.
So just throwing in some more
Yes.
recommendations for that.
Yes.
And Andrew had another question.
Mhm.
When you finished the hand washing ritual and turned to enter a hospital room to become a witness, did it feel like you were following someone into the room, or was it more like you weren't following anyone, just being open to who you might be following next?
I wanted to be open to whatever happened next, right? I wasn't going to bring anything or anyone into me. I wasn't following anyone. I was entering and to see what came at me. Does that make sense? Because I
Mhm.
can't. Now I can have clues. I can read the medical chart. I can talk to the doctors. Particularly on the first encounter, right? But I'm never quite sure. It's a mystery. I'm never quite sure what's going to be. And in the ICU, there's always windows you can see in to the room. But family member hop in. You just have to be really open, and that allows you flexibility to meet whatever the moment is, right? So I always slowly open the door, right? And I come in and I kind of stand at the door before I approach the bed and I say hello. I don't always tell them I'm the chaplain, but they almost always seem to know I'm the chaplain. May I come in? So I'm doing all the trauma things. I don't enter fast. I ask for permission. May I be seated? Would you like to have a conversation? And then letting them control the answers, right? And meanwhile, while they're trying to, and sometimes their first words are the ones that are actually uncensored, right? They'll say, I'm in a lot of pain today. And then they'll try to minimize it later, right? That's another clue to what's true. And meanwhile, my eyes are scouring the room. It's an old, I don't know, it's an old Sherlock trick, but what's on the walls, what isn't on the walls. A lot of it is what isn't there, who isn't there. Are there sometimes there's biblical messages on the wall. Balloons, no balloons, family, no family, right? You just, how many machines are on this person? But I let all that, I'm trying to let that information flow in without a construct, right? There is a spiritual assessment construct, so that when I'm listening to the person, it all starts to make sense, right? So one time we had a patient. I was outside the room, it was ICU, so I could hear the family praying, and they were praying in a particular way to the patient about Holy Spirit, come on them, heal them, whatever. All I had to do was turn to the doctor and say, they're going to be fundamentalists. They're going to think a miracle is going to happen. It's going to be very hard to really communicate with them. I could tell all that just from the prayer, right? Now, I'm not sure everybody has that ability, but I want to hear all that and let it sort of filter in its own way, and let there be some confirmation. That's where the listening is. Can I sit by you? Is it all right if I sit down? I always ask permission and then just see what comes at me. So it's not a following, it's a taking in. Like Jesus felt the hem, the power of the woman on the hem, right? When the woman reaches out and he says, who touched my garment? Jesus wasn't looking for the woman came to Jesus, and Jesus sensed it. I don't know if that makes any sense.
Yeah, and I appreciate you calling out the importance of asking for permission and giving people options all the time, because so much of trauma is that experience of powerlessness in the face of overwhelm. And so
Right.
anytime we can create those choices and those options for people,
Mm-hmm.
it's a healing safety thing. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. Um, and then, sit and listen. And some of your experience will take in. You're trying to figure out what they need, right? That's a spiritual assessment. But it doesn't mean you're talking to them, right?
Mhm.
It just means you're just
Mhm.
trying to evaluate. So chaplains would do what they call the first initial encounter, assuming it's not in the ED lobby where all hell's breaking loose, is really an assessment. What's their need? What's their spiritual need? What's their emotional need? Sometimes it's just they need a meal ticket to eat, right? And you can't talk to them till they eat, right? So you run around to the social worker and get them a meal ticket. But it's that kind of thing that clears the way for getting at the real thing.
Yeah. Yeah. Wes asks, my son working with vets at a vet center would bring in recorded music of the time in that person's life when music was a powerful influence, often while they were, quote unquote, in country under extreme circumstances. And it would help them to talk, to come out of their shell, to feel a connection, be human from a positive place. That's more of a comment than a question, but I
No,
love
but
that. That's worth sharing.
I use music a lot. Well, not only do I recall music in the book just to kind of set time and scene and whatever, and sometimes I replayed that music to get me back into something, and I use music a lot to get at the emotion.
Mhm.
I play music in the morning or before I take a break. Nothing's coming to me. I have certain music I play.
Yeah, Rebecca had a beautiful observation. So many insightful and important things here, Ellen. A couple of other trauma symptoms I've noticed in myself and others, ones you didn't mention: defensiveness or even aggression toward others, the need
Mm-hmm.
to withdraw or defend against harm, the
Mm-hmm.
temptation to become the persecutor out of one's own trauma without acknowledging that,
Mm-hmm.
the need to control one's environment and perhaps inadvertently others.
Mm-hmm.
One form control can take is over intellectualization, the belief that if I can just talk rationally about something, I have
Mm-hmm.
dealt with it emotionally or physiologically.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And also, victims can sometimes almost cling to their triggers rather than healing, making others responsible for them, but only the person themselves can really do this.
All of that is spot on, and yeah, sometimes, many times, it's my true confessions. I've come off as the aggressor, right, in any situation. It gets me in trouble a lot. Rather and rational, yes, anything to disconnect our emotions, and this is all great, but if you don't want to deal with yourself, right? If you don't want to really take the hard time to um, reflect, be willing to go in the next day and say, I made a mistake, or I'm sorry, or in therapy going, I'm really mad at the therapist for saying that, right? And you stay mad for days. And then you have to go in and say you were right, right? At some point you have to engage it. And there are many people who don't and won't. And it's like people want the, what do they call it? The enemy we know is better than the enemy we don't know, right? And so uh, uh, depression becomes an automated response. And you like the depression because you know what happens in the depression, right? I've known that, or so you are spot on. And but even like to write this book, there are parts of this book I can't read aloud to others, right? Because it's still too emotional. It's just too much. And there are things I wrote. I remember years and years and years ago, Suzanne Sommer may have been one of the first celebrities to write a memoir. She talks about, oh, I had to cry through every chapter. I'm like, oh, this is just silliness, right? But yeah, I did. I cried when I reread it. I cried when I read it to my daughter. Uh, I almost cried at the Theology&Peace conference when I tried to read about the blind man, right? But unless I emotionally invested in it, then it was worth nothing to the people who would read it, right? They would sense it wasn't genuine, and it needed to be genuine. And somebody asked me, I saw that question pop up about, was it a healing experience? I don't know if that person's still here. Absolutely. If the book never sold one book, it was worth writing, because even to the very end, I was still learning stuff about myself, rethinking how I saw my mother, rethinking how I saw my father, rethinking how I saw events, learning how different events affected the next one, right? That all came, some of it was known, but some of it is the writing process. And even the last chapter, it's funny. It didn't exist. I kept saying, where am I going to put my ordination? And I just couldn't figure it out. And then I talked to my developmental. I know I'm rambling. I talked to my developmental editor. God bless her, Natalie. I said, I've written 2 books. There's this book about my past life, and there's a book about my present life. I don't know. It still felt like I was 2 people, right? And then I had to come to realize, no, I've become one person. And that's where the confidence and the ability. I talked to you about without shaking. There was a time when I couldn't mention my mother's name without shaking. Or people say, so tell us about your mother. I'd be like, yeah, how about that? How about going to that concert next week, right? I was very good at that.
Yeah.
But I would say,
Question. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Rebecca was the one who asked about was the book healing to you
Yes.
in a new way? And that's beautiful. And
Yes.
she also mentioned that a book that was very helpful to her at a difficult time was Why People Don't Heal and How They Can by Carolyn Myss.
Yes. Oh, yeah. I've heard. Yeah. Yeah. You've told me or others. Yeah. I need to get that. I've looked it up a couple of times. Yeah. But yeah, there are a lot of excellent people out there who've written excellent things. And it's really about what resonates with you. Like, so there's not one path, right? There's not a protocol, um, but there are some things we can do.
Matthew had a great question that I want to make sure we get to. If you'd been a trauma-informed chaplain first and then become a public prosecutor, how do you think that would have changed your approach to prosecution in court processes?
I think it wouldn't have exhausted me the way it did. That's the first thing, right? Um, and I think I wouldn't have been as triggered as I often was in conversations with defense attorneys, maybe, and situations, because I would have known how to calm myself and also how to, instead of seeing them as the enemy, seeing them more as being able to let go and see them as they're just being whatever they are because they have to defend their client, as opposed to feeling it such a personal affront sometimes in the encounters. And I think it might have even improved how I dealt with witnesses, and made it a better experience for them. Or even police, all witnesses, whether they're a police officer or what we would call a civilian witness or the victim, they all needed to be handled probably better than I I was pretty good, but the way I saw them treated or the way the courts treated them and things like that. But I think I might have lasted, that's terrible to think I'd last longer than 20 years because that would be like, whoa, okay. But I think it would have been an easier profession for me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Certainly more resources and nourishment for you.
Yes, yes. I wouldn't be exhausted all the time. Yeah.
Well, I'll tack one question of my own onto the end there, because I could keep going all night. I had lots of questions, but I'll take pity on everybody. You described the role of a chaplain as being and contrasted it with a pastor's role of doing. But
Mm-hmm.
hospitals tend to be systems heavily focused on efficiency and outcomes. You talked a bit about the importance of creating spaces for patients that minimized the impact of that hospital environment. But I'm wondering, how do you stay grounded in your role of just being while surrounded by that culture of constant doing?
Mm-hmm. One thing, and this comes from having been a prosecutor, holding your space, right? Sometimes I told the doctor they were just going to have to wait, right? They didn't like that. But if I'm in the middle of something, they just barge right in. I'd say, can I have more time, right? Coming back in the afternoon when there's less procedures, like making the initial contact and coming back when I knew there'd be more time to meet with the patient or the family. Going out, sometimes I spoke to people out in the lobby, right, or took them aside. So it's not just patients, but family members to make space for them. They called one of my when people, chaplains, older chaplains, call that exerting your chaplain authority. Beginning, it takes time, but beginning to have confidence in the fact that we're in a family meeting, asserting myself in ways uh, when it was appropriate, right, to either help with the family or clarify a question. But you do have a certain amount of authority, and theoretically, in a hospital, you are part of the medical team, right? So you should be able to have some, but having bye, Matthew. Thank you for joining us. Someday I'll make it to Australia. Um, but learning how to make that time and that space, and often I was pretty fast, right? I could do these things faster. I didn't need hours to talk to somebody, but you do need to hold your ground, or I wouldn't leave the room when the doctor was in there. I'd just stay, right? Look, you mind if I stay? No, they won't. They do their thing, and then I'd stay there and start again. But you had to learn how to make space, learn how to feel that you're authorized to be there, try not to be intimidated, hold a bunch of different things to hold that space.
Well, if there's one thing that people get out of reading this book of yours, what do you hope they walk away with?
Um, I don't know. It sounds corny, but I think it's what's at the end, that we are all loved by God, that no matter what happens, we are companioned, and that we can be secure because that's not going away, right? If we can somehow center ourselves in that love, everything else can kind of be handled. But if we're not grounded and centered in that feeling, we're just kind of floating around. But I think that, and I think the blind man's story is so important to me, that there are transformational moments that can happen between individuals.
Yeah.
And they are unbelievable. Certainly this old cranky, cynical prosecutor was never going to believe it. So, and I do. What can I say? It's like I
Miracles do
say at the end of the
exist.
book, for not to give it away, but I think most of you have read it, but I say, I make a joke on myself about God had nothing to do with it. God had everything to do with it, right? I think that's the message. Thank you. And I'm happy to talk to you anytime, January, if you have more questions, but we'll be in the space.